Hello and welcome to NewsReal with Joe and Neil.
I'm Joe.
I'm Neil. It's Sunday, what's the date today?
January the 13th.
13th, 2019. So in this day and age, as everyone can see and experience for themselves, thanks to, among other things, the proliferation of communications and social media, it seems that just about everything is up for discussion, up for revision, up for reaffirming, and it's causing like incredible amounts of polemic, polarization. I suppose the I don't know. There's a kind of an eschatological element to mainstream religion, and even to the more modern kind of new agey beliefs that we would be going through. They prophesized a time when all will come out in the wash. It all would be revealed. Now, most of the time you got a kind of a nice halo over that it would be the time of the great unveiling and everything would be revealed and it would be great. What we're finding it's more like everything's coming to the surface. All the internal contradictions in society, among people, and then even within people, come to the fore, and it's pretty fractious,
Yeah.
Obviously, the main simple division is left versus right when it comes to politics, but it's so much more than that, isn't it? Like pro-Islam, anti-Islam, pro-migrant, anti-migrant, feminazis versus the manosphere. It's like everything's up for picking a side, and people are doing it.
Picking apart and picking a side, yeah. It's, there's, a couple of things. One is that a lot of people, you talk about eschatological kind of end time stuff, and a lot of people, I get the impression that a lot of people who aren't necessarily religious or practicing or religiously inclined or whatever, still talk about it in those terms when they look at some particular moment of craziness that's happening on the planet. They'll say, geez, it's kind of like, or they'll make some reference to end of the world or something like that, because obviously those memes or those ideas of, especially in the West, and which is mostly a Christian, Judeo-Christian culture, that's in people's minds and in their heads, from when they were brought up, when they were exposed to one extent or another to religion. So they have this idea of the end times, or maybe it's even deeper than that, I don't know. But basically people have that on the tips of their tongue whenever things are going crazy on the planet, particularly in a widespread kind of way. A war is one thing, whatever, people maybe got used to that, that happens. But when people I see that when people see the level of chaos and social chaos and division, they tend to go to that place of saying, Jesus, like, it's almost like this is the end of the world type thing or something, or maybe the end of the world is coming or something like that, They do it in a tongue-in-cheek way, but they still say it, And the other thing is you can look at it all as in a very negative way. Say that it's crazy, people a lot of people have lost the plot. There's so much extremism going on, so little, rational thinking or nuanced thinking, so much black and white thinking, and it's terrible. And a lot of people are afraid of, rightfully so, I'd say, they're afraid of what's happening in the world and to their societies, depending on where you live and how bad it can get and stuff. But at the same time, like you just kind of mentioned, it's almost like there's a lot of stuff coming out and people are bringing up things within them, their ideas that are coming up to be dealt with, let's say. People are being forced to think about things more deeply than they usually are in human societies in the past. And, that's a good thing. From one perspective, that's a good thing, It's kind of like you imagine a family where there's an awful lot of stuff going on below the surface, old grievances, old hurts and stuff, but nobody ever talks about it. And then one day, somebody says something and that just blows the whole thing wide open, and everybody then is at each other's throats, arguing, recriminations, accusations, blah, blah, blah. That's maybe a good analogy for what's happening with the human family, let's say, particularly in the West, but to some extent around the world, but it seems to be focused on the West, where the big Western Judeo-Christian family are having to do some soul searching and having to really sort out their issues and their differences and hopefully come to some resolution or some conclusion, at least a deeper level of understanding, you would hope. I think that is available for some people to do, as long as they approach it in the right way. But a lot of people are probably doing it in the wrong way. They're sticking to their guns, sticking to their position. They're right, everybody else is wrong. It's not a productive way to approach the situation, you know. But of course, you'll have to approach it in a more positive way. You would have to see that what benefits one must benefit all. You know, there's a community aspect to it where, you know, we all rise or fall together type thing. So it's not a good idea to say, well, I'm just going to stick to my guns and screw you, I'm right, you're wrong. That's not helpful for you or for anybody else, for the society that you live in, you know. So, yeah, it's kind of very interesting times that we live in. And like I said, there's a lot of chaos, a lot of nonsense, a lot of craziness. But hopefully something good will come out of it. Or we're all going to die.
or neither. So the neither would be something like, not much good can come out of it. But for some, if they don't fall into the trap, they can do well. They can thrive, in fact.
Yeah.
They can, to quote someone who's made this a popular term but has older meaning for us, they can ride the wave.
Yeah.
Rather than be washed under it.
Yeah.
By it's the sheer strength of it.
Right. And the other aspect is that, you know, you can say, well, don't get worked up about it. You know, why are people getting so worked up? It's not such a big thing. People who are observing it, let's say, might think they would suggest that it's not such a big deal. You know, this has happened before in human history. You know, societies have been divided. There's been serious polemics, you know, that have come up and that have divided populations in specific countries or in more than one country. There's even been, you know, some level of kind of social strife or social conflict, and it's, you know, it's just what happens, you know, in human society. So it's 'twas ever so type thing. It's just no big deal really. But I don't think that's the case really, because we live in a very unique time, where in previous societies literally before the last 25 years, people did not have the access to information that they have today, and the ability to interact with each other, with millions of other people potentially, you know, instantaneously or immediately as something unfolds. You think about social issues 100 years ago or 200 years ago. They were relatively small. Not a lot of people necessarily in the country would have known about it even, and even fewer would have been directly involved in it. And for that reason, it would kind of peter out. You know, those kind of things never went on for too long. You know, I'm leaving out wars here. I'm talking about social conflict or social, you know, dividing of the population on one side of the aisle or another. Sometimes it actually led directly to a war, but the wars usually, kind of civil wars in the West, were quite short-lived as well. You know, and again, not everybody was involved in it. But today, with the internet, we did a show last year on why the internet should be 9/11. 9/11, the internet, the internet should be destroyed. That was just my take. It was kind of devil's advocate kind of approach. That I thought that the internet overall was a force for
Negative.
Was a negative force rather than a positive force overall. But then you can't really separate those two, because if you decide that the internet should go, then you lose some of the positivity, the positive aspects of it. Certainly, we have benefited from.
You lose its potential, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not really something you can take a strong or hardline approach on. But
just in case anyone misunderstands us, when we're saying between the lines, are we saying something like, don't take a hard stand on anything and be quiet? You see how it could be misconstrued as just stay back and stay quiet and don't raise your head above the parapet lest you get shot, metaphorically or possibly even literally. But that's not what we mean, is it? I mean, you can take a strong stance and stand your ground on whatever principles you have come to accept at that time, but without having to do or say anything precipitate that is potentially dangerous.
Right.
Something like that.
Well, there's kind of two sides. It's not, again, it's not simple. It's not black and white, and that's a good example of the truth of what we're saying, that of how things, when they go black and white, that they're wrong. The answer to that question as to what people should or shouldn't do is not black and white. It's nuanced, and it can be also be specific to the person and to their particular situation in their lives, what's going on in their community, you know. But So, for example, if for example, stories that are relevant today, where countries in Europe have been and even are today. I think there was a story today from Germany, where an Afghan refugee, I think, went into a hospital and stabbed a pregnant Polish woman, and she lost her baby as a result. Now, that's the kind of thing there's been many examples of that in the past few years in European countries, and to some extent in the US as well. And that's the kind of thing that would seriously inflame tensions and could get someone really worked up about, and would put them obviously on an anti-immigrant, and you can understand why it would put them on an anti-immigrant stance. But that's that specific situation. Do you want to get in the streets and protest that? If there's a protest going on in Germany tomorrow, for example, to protest immigration, do you want to go on the basis of that story? Do you want to go and defend as a German, let's say, do you want to defend German kind of society and to stop this kind of thing happening? And obviously the answer in theory would be to stop immigration, or to campaign for the cancellation of German immigration policy, German government's immigration policy. Nobody's going to argue with you, or nobody's going to say that's the wrong thing to do. I mean, they could argue and say it's only one case, blah, 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 there's lots of good immigrants, blah, blah, blah. But I think, and so extrapolate that out to any issue that you get worked up at, from you see that hits your kind of like your moral foundations, or what you feel strongly, and pushes those buttons. You should also, while constating that to yourself and recognizing that that's the way you feel, it's important to understand, or bring in some understanding about human nature and about how the world works, and how that there may well be people in the world today in positions of power who have an interest in dividing society, particularly Western society, but any societies. I mean, there's a long track record of particularly, again, Western powers, but not only, but Western powers going around the world and divide and rule, using divide and rule policies or strategies within countries to set local people against each other so they can more easily control them and rule them. And it's not a big stretch to suggest that may be at work in Western society. And
it's so abstract, though, to go from there to a guy going into hospital and stabbing a pregnant woman.
Right, but it's not that particular incident is. It's abstract. It's not. I wouldn't say it's so much abstract as opposed to but rather it posits a very, very complex, and you would probably say monstrous scheme or plot, if that's one of the end results of it. I.e., someone deliberately planned to, or is deliberately planning to, bring in as many refugees or migrants into European countries, knowing that they haven't been kind of integrated, or it would be difficult to integrate them, and they come from a different culture and a different background. Many of them come from, let's say, war, conflict zones. They've been traumatized themselves, so they're a bit unhinged and a bit destabilized. So out of every 10,000 migrants, there's going to be a few who will act in this way, who will just, in some way or other, you're not going to, define it right down to, or plan it right down to that guy going into the hospital. But in general, that some of them are going to act up and inflame tensions in Western societies and cause that kind of division among the people, because obviously there are different types of people, and this is one of the fundamental things that people need to understand, is that there are deep psychological differences between human beings. There's a lot of literature, a lot of psychological literature and studies done on this to show that people do have, one of the books that we keep referencing is Jonathan Haidt's, I keep forgetting the frickin' title of it.
The Righteous Mind.
The Righteous Mind, yeah. Why good people are divided by politics and religion, I think. But the fact of the matter is that people do have foundational differences, let's say. There are, and they can be broken down. That's why they've been broken down into conservative and left-leaning or liberal, whatever. The conservatives tend to, among other things, value loyalty to their group and sanctity and
of the nation or
of the nation
a higher body,
power,
yeah.
basically. Whereas more left-leaning people, fundamentally, foundationally, as part of their makeup, they were born with it. Let's say this is the way they're wired. Left-leaning people tend to care. Well, focus more on they have more of a care foundation, and they're triggered more by care and consideration for others, for the oppressed, for poor people, or for, in whatever way, marginalised people, etc. People suffering, and they want to care for them. So they have their bleeding hearts. That's what they call bleeding heart liberals. Whereas conservatives tend to be more focused on conservatism, let's say tradition, their group tradition, loyalty to that, and like you mentioned, sanctity and the idea of a higher power or authority. So there are very foundational differences that make people respond quite differently in different situations. So the idea would be that someone knows that. I mean, and it's been like that idea has been around, it's been understood for a long time by social scientists and obviously by rulers of countries who use social scientists, use scientific information to help govern the country. Let's say their understanding of the psychology of human beings seems to be quite developed. So this conspiracy that I'm positing here is that to keep in mind the possible conspiracy that someone is deliberately trying to divide Western society for a specific purpose. Now, it's not a very complex purpose. It's as old as time in a certain sense. And I mentioned it before, which is that it's divide and rule. And it's a clique or a group of leaders who have been in power, or an establishment that has been in power for a very long time. And they are corrupt and increasingly corrupt and increasingly self-centered, increasingly don't care about the people. The people then respond to that, like with the Yellow Vest protests in France and in other places of late. And the response to that is, well, we need to divide these people. We basically need to have them fighting each other rather than fighting us, because we like our positions of power and authority, and we don't want to lose it. But we're the type of people who just can't stop serving ourselves primarily over serving. What we're meant to do is serving the people. So they can't do that because they're constitutionally kind of driven to do that, to serve themselves. So they're going to provoke a reaction among the population, and they understand. I mean, and again, this isn't new. This is like been around throughout human history. This idea and the strategy of controlling a population, of dividing them against each other. Now, I'm just saying that since that strategy has been around for a long time, of a group of elite people in power trying to divide in times when the people are rising up against and angry at the authorities then use tactics to divide those people. I'm saying that that's what we see today. And you can't remove some conscious input from the authorities or from some powers in implementing that strategy. A strategy just doesn't develop by itself. It just doesn't all happen by accident. There are people in power who are corrupt and do want to, at all costs, hold on to their power and do see that the people are angry with them and do implement strategies. So then you look and say, well, what's playing out in the world today? And you see that that Western countries, again in particular, are divided, are being divided, have been over the past several years, increasingly divided against each other along these kind of fundamental ideological lines. So when you find yourself being polarized to one end because of some event in the news, that by definition would put you potentially at odds with your neighbor, the guy living next door to you. Think about, all I'm saying is you should, before you get out in the streets and start marching and screaming at people and maybe screaming at your neighbor, you should keep in mind that you may be playing into a deliberate strategy to get you to do exactly what you're doing. And it's not in your best interest.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like I said, I can understand fully people's responses based on my understanding from the work of other people of those differences in human beings and what makes them tick, and that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with the left kind of a foundation, the leftist kind of care foundation and consideration for other people. And there's nothing wrong with the right's, the conservative kind of more moral kind of loyalty and sanctity and authority foundation. Both of them are necessary for a properly functioning society. And there is a middle ground that can be found between the two, but it's very easily split or divided or provoked. Those differences are very easily exacerbated. And what I'm saying is that I see those differences being exacerbated or being provoked. And I can also track it back, obviously, in the case of immigration, I can track it back to conscious decisions by Western powers to bomb and destroy Middle Eastern countries and African countries where the immigrants are coming from that are causing those social divisions. So are you going to be a coincidence theorist then? That was all just by accident? Fair enough, if you want to do that. It still doesn't change the fact that it's happening. But I suppose the key ingredient is if it's conscious or not, then you can assume, I suppose, if you fall on the side of I think it's most likely to be conscious, well then you can assume that it doesn't have a good end result for you. You know, if it's just accidental, then maybe you're more free to go, well, we'll just go with it, you know, because that's just the way these things happen and have to be sorted out one way or another, and may the best man win type thing. But if there's a controlling hand in it that is specifically trying to create a negative situation for everybody on both sides of the conflict or the debate, then I would, at the very least, I'm not saying people shouldn't get out and protest and express what they think, stand up for their rights and stuff, but just pay attention to what's going on, at the very least, and be careful.
There were two other incidents in Germany last week, which were pretty horrific as well, and it's interesting in the way they contrast with the story you just cited of the Afghan. I presume he was a refugee, and I presume that was his partner who he went into the hospital and stabbed.
Maybe, yeah.
They happened, two incidents, they happened 3 days apart. I think it was the same city in eastern Germany. On the first occasion, someone set off some kind of bomb, explosive, outside the offices of the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, the so-called new far-right party, anti-migrant party in Germany. Just 2 days, or 2 or 3 days later, somebody, I think from the same city, an elected AfD official,
right,
MP, was so brutally attacked he almost died. You might have seen the photos of the damage to his face. Probably an attempted assassination. I think it's actually lucky that he was not killed. There's no information that I know about who did that, but I just found the confluence of those two things coming so close together. I think in the same city.
Yeah.
Really weird. Now, conspiracy aside, imagine that you're not thinking, you're not going to bother, you're just taking it at face value, you hear that news. What would be, if you were a supporter loosely, or maybe really ardently, of AfD in Germany, what would your impressions of that double hit be?
Yeah, well, you would be enraged further enraged at the immigration policies of the German government, and you would resolve that you're going to do whatever is necessary to make sure that those policies are changed, or if that's not possible, you're going to take direct action against immigrants. Yeah,
my side is under attack.
Right.
I have concrete evidence. It's in my face. My side is under attack.
That's the conservative loyalty foundation. That is very hard to, won't be overcome. Yeah. That they'll always go with that. Whereas the liberals could very easily switch. They may feel that they'll have some sense of concern for their society and bad things happening in their society, but they'll very easily switch because of their nature. They'll very easily switch to actually caring more about, when it comes down to it, they'll care more about the immigrants, because they can easily be provoked by images and stories about immigrants coming with their children and their, there's no food, no shelter, and they'll end up going down to help the immigrants rather than take a stand against them. My problem is that I actually, on one hand, there's more hope in the conspiracy theory angle, because it suggests that someone is deliberately trying to provoke a kind of clash of ideologies in society and create a bad situation in Western societies that they have to actually consciously involve themselves in. For example, they could have put someone up to beating up that AfD politician to deliberately inflame tensions. And if that's the case, then that suggests that if these people weren't consciously trying to inflame the situation, it wouldn't be so bad, and human beings could resolve to you could kind of basically work it out on their own. That things ultimately people would see a bit of sense and realize that they're the ones who are going to lose in any kind of social conflict, so they're not going to go there. And so there'll be less of that. People would not go to the extremes of provoking the other side and creating a violence in their own society, from which everybody is going to lose. So the conspiracy suggests that it's kind of hopeful in a certain sense, even though it's bad. It posits that someone's deliberately trying to make things worse, because otherwise they would be okay.
Otherwise they would naturally resolve.
But if it's just coincidence and it's just the way human beings are, well, then you have less hope, because the blame falls on ordinary human beings. And you get the feeling that, well, that's just the way human beings are. They're always going to be at each other's throats eventually. And,
so I just throw my hands up. They're all going to tear each other apart.
So either walk away or just give up hope, or you get stuck into the battle,
Yeah.
But
so what's going on in France then? Is that bucking the trend, so to speak, in that 9 weeks in now? I mean, this weekend was more intense than last weekend. The numbers thing is weird. That the French government said that initially they said there were about 25,000 protesters across France, including Paris and many other cities this weekend. But that doesn't make any sense, because they said they had at least 80,000 security forces out in the streets. And you look at the videos and you're not seeing a sea of blue and like 2 yellow jackets. You're seeing a sea of yellow jackets and a few police here and there, and maybe a lot at one end of the street or the city or whatever. Anyway, the point is that they still have major support nationwide. 2 months, we're going to be going to 3 months soon. Is this I want to say is it hopeful? Is it in fact bucking the trend of dividing? Is it a response to, because when you hear a lot of what they have to say, individuals who have actually been on the media to speak, sort of spokespeople of the Yellow Vest movement, or simply when they're being interviewed impromptu on the streets, they're all about how, we're in this together, and they specifically say that the problem is upstairs. It's not the guys over there or the people coming in from over there.
Right.
It's them.
Yeah.
The rich.
Yeah, and that's why the Yellow Vest protests in France have kind of been very heartening for people in other countries, and provoked or made them respond in kind, essentially, in their own countries, to take on, to wear the yellow vests and engage in similar kinds of protests. It hasn't really taken on to the same extent in other countries as it has in France, But it is, yes, hopeful that, because that's ultimately, if people are going to protest and complain about problems in the world, then, or problems in this case in France, the problems clearly do stem from corruption in government and corrupt officials and their agendas that really aren't serving the interests of the ordinary people. And I mean, French people still have it fairly okay. I mean, they don't have that much. It's all relative, right? They don't have that much to complain about, right? They're not living on, $1 a day or anything like that, They're not going to, like, what do you call them? To rubbish or trash heaps and sorting through trash heaps for food and clothing or anything like that. So it could get a lot worse. So you could argue that French people are a bit too entitled, if you know what I mean. They should just suck it up. They have it pretty good compared to a lot of people in the world. But I think it's more than that. There's more than just as has been suggested, it's more than just the taxes and that kind of stuff. That the people really don't like the government. They don't like Emmanuel Macron and what he stands for. They don't like the way he talks and what he espouses. And that's fully, for me, it's completely understandable, I mean, someone who stands up, and a French president that stands up on the day of the commemoration of the end of the First World War and denounces nationalism, and it's just in its, and that should be understand, just nationalism in its purest form, which is people who, people from a country who like that country and like the culture and like the values that country holds. For a president to get up and denounce that publicly, it's just like unconscionable. He's an idiot, basically. I can't imagine. But he has his own ideology, and I don't for a moment think that it's really a genuinely or honestly motivated ideology. I don't think he's just a bit deluded. I think he's kind of like, he's working. I mean, the guy who is reportedly his lover, the guy Benalla, who was involved in the scandals over the past 6 months or so, where he was basically a a confidant of Macron's. He explicitly said, and he's in a good position to know, that Macron is just simply doing the bidding crazy. He's fulfilling or following crazy policies. Bullshit, the guy called them, just that they're making him do a ridiculous amount of bullshit, you know. But Macron has his part to play in that. He's willingly doing it, so he's signed up to that agenda, you know. So you can't say that he's not. Nobody's twisting his arm, you know. But he is being told what to do. Like most presidents of most countries, particularly in the West, are more or less told what to do and when to do it by other people who are usually not elected, by career diplomats and kind of establishment figures. They're the ones who decide the policies and what they should and shouldn't do. And the president or the prime minister or the leader of the country is simply the person who has to get out there in front of the people and try and convince them to accept, you know, or to manipulate them into accepting, or to lie to them, basically, about what's actually going on. You know, so I think French people, the Yellow Vests, don't like Macron, don't like what he stands for, because he's not really he's not the person that they elect. He doesn't represent them, as supposedly is a narrative, right? The French people elect a president. He's meant to do what they want. Well, he's not doing what they want, and it's pretty clear. And most French people know that he's doing the bidding of someone else that does not have the interests of French people at heart. So just that in general, that general idea is what angers the French people and want a change in the system. They get so specific about taxes and all this kind of stuff, blah, 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 but I don't think that's really the issue, you know. I think it's they just don't like the government.
Yeah.
For those
As
reasons.
Andrew Breitbart said famously, politics is downstream from culture.
Right.
And I think of this as like the French population is vomiting out the whole array, but they're all quite tightly connected, the whole array of new cultural norms, ideologies in plural, but they form one overall ideology that's being shoved down their throats, so to speak. And it's lies as well. It's a kind of a rejection of. It's the same in France as in the Anglosphere and many other countries, where it's gotten to it's become a daily barrage of bullshit. I mean, Americans know this too. They complain about it as well. So it's the same situation in France. It's just non-stop. It's nothing. Nothing is sacred anymore. They will just lie and lie and lie, and then lies upon lies and so on.
But just to follow up what you were saying earlier on, that yes, the Gilets Jaunes, the protesters in France, don't seem to be divided along that left-right kind of pro or anti-immigrant or pro-anti, you know, conservative versus liberal, whatever way you want to describe it. They don't seem to be divided, or haven't taken the bait to divide themselves along those lines. You know, it hasn't worked in France, let's say, to the extent that the government has tried to push that division. It hasn't worked in France. And it's a credit to the French people that they're a bit more clued in, and they're historically suspicious, which helps. They're just historically, by definition, suspicious of the government. When the government says something, the first thing they think is, they're probably lying. Let's check to see if there's anything truthful about what they've said at all. And then we'll look for the truth. But they assume that the government is corrupt and assume that the government's lying, and they don't have that kind of... they're not awestruck.
Yes.
For the most part, they're not awestruck by authority or by governments, you know, which is, I suppose, why they're historically kind of maybe a bit more seen as a bit more leftist leaning. But they're a good mix. That's what makes them kind of strange. They're a good mix of it, you know.
I found it interesting watching the alternative independent commentators, let's say online mostly. Forget about the mainstream commentators. They're, of course, just following the overall, let's say, globalist party line. But even in the alternative, it's interesting how people are viewing it through their lens. Now, most of them are fundamentally getting it in that left and right are basically united. But they still have their slant on it where they'll read into what they want. So if you're basically of the new right, of the conservative values, pushing back against globalization, pro-nation state, you're seeing this substantially as the French people waving the tricolour. Therefore, that's a nationalist,
right.
And you can find specific evidence for it, because now look at this. They have banners about being anti-mass migration and so on, or anti-terrorism, whatever. And then, of course, on the flip side, if you're of a more left-leaning, you're like, yes, finally, the revolution, the workers' revolution is really here. It's come.
Right.
This is great.
Right.
And they're all going, this is great. But they don't understand maybe that on the streets in France today, they're both there. They both know they're different when they talk to each other, but they're agreeing explicitly, I imagine, in the conversations
Right.
they're having,
But the
and
first step,
implicitly as a whole, to put aside their relatively minor differences in the interest of a much greater difference that exists, the chasm between a very small established elite, multi-generational really,
yeah.
and them,
Well,
the great unwashed.
Well, that's
you
the
know?
problem with Macron. He's taken up a centrist position. And like I said this in previous shows, that by taking up a centrist position, he thought he would unite people, but he's actually succeeded in not serving either the left or the right interests, because you're in the middle, right? And that's actually what he does. And those people, the protesters, like you said, realize that, yeah, they may have differences, but ultimately they can't even get to the point of resolving those differences if they don't sort this government out first. The first step to even trying to get what they want based on their left or right-leaning tendencies, they need to get rid of the government first. They need to do something about the government first, you know. And Macron, yeah, you notice that he actually is pissing off both sides. It's bizarre, but he's pissing off both sides. In other countries, the government either, you know, takes at least in their words, and most of their actions, whatever they're doing behind the scenes, but in most of their words and actions, they'll either take, if it's a conservative government, they'll take mostly conservative lines or
in the UK, for example,
right.
the government's essentially
right.
following the result of the referendum and
right.
pro-Brexit.
Right, and Trump is sticking to kind of conservative ideals and that kind of stuff. And you find the same in other countries. But Macron, the idiot, like comes up on his backers who are even more idiotic for backing him and pushing him in this direction. He's clearly seen and is serving big business interests at the expense of the French people, which is really pisses off the lefties because they want socialism, right? They want state nationalisation of state kind of services, and and you can't touch the National Health Service. The welfare state has to remain, and you have to look after the poor and all that kind of stuff. Basically, welfare. But he's serving big business. He's not charging. He's reducing on basically there's no taxes really for big corporations, and he comes from a Rothschild bank. I mean, he's a big businessman, you know. So he pisses off the left for that reason. At the same time, then he comes out and he starts tries to kind of attract the left by talking pro-immigration and saying there's no such thing as nationalism, which serves to piss off the right. Yeah. So who's he talking to? Yeah. You're talking to nobody in France. You're appealing to nobody. Do you realise that? And then you wonder why you have these protests in France, of united protests. I mean, it's absolutely himself and his backers have only themselves to blame for pursuing that policy. And these protests were an eminently foreseeable result of that policy, of pissing everybody off, and thinking that you're uniting them. I mean, talk about delusional, like it's bizarre, you know.
Something I've been asked about frequently is, are these yellow vest protests going to spread? Now there have been some startup, let's say, smaller protests, mostly in Western Europe, but even as far as Australia, the US, I don't think so. Even Taiwan, apparently there was some kind of strike or something, and they were all wearing the gilets jaunes or whatever they have equivalent. But really, it's still maybe in Belgium it's pretty hot there too, but it's still substantially contained to France. Do you think it's likely that this is the kind of the thing of the era? It'll be some kind of a European or wider spring, maybe just not yet? Or this is the flip side of the discussion we're having, where if it's a trap to become too entrenched in one view or the other, and therefore miss the real fundamental division that exists in terms of a totally disconnected oligarchy or elite or establishment or deep state versus the great mass of people who have far more in common than not.
I don't.
Which will win, so to speak, the phony division or the actual one?
Well, that's the battle that's going on, you know, and I don't see the protests in France as a trap. I don't see them as what they're doing because of what we said, that people are genuinely seem to be united against and focusing their anger in the right direction, you know. So they haven't taken the bait, but the that left-right division that we talked about, and the possibility that it's being consciously implemented is a more, broad scale, and it focuses here in one country at one point, and then in another country, and it pushes certain agendas. I think it's a longer scale plan, if you know what I mean. It's not something that's can be implemented in a few months and then achieve its results. It's been going on for several years. It's been going on for maybe decades, if you want to look at it from a broader, in a longer term. But at the same time, those divisions have existed naturally in human beings, like we said. But it seems to have come to a point where there do seem to be people in positions of power, even behind the throne, if you know what I mean, a deep state type of thing, who know those divisions and have decided that it's a good idea in their own interests, in the interest of keeping themselves in power, to encourage divisions in different ways over a longer period of time, to encourage divisions in the population. I mean, one interesting point is, you look at France, it would almost suggest that these people that I'm positing are doing what they're doing have known that the French population, the French people, are a bit more resistant to those kind of divisive tactics, because the worst and biggest terror attacks over the past number of years, perhaps throughout the whole war on terror in terms of the European continent, have happened in France. Mm-hmm. And clearly those kind of attacks by ISIS at least have the potential, if you don't want to assign a conscious conspiracy behind them, they at least have the potential, or should have the potential, to inflame
a country with such a large Muslim minority,
with 15 million Muslims and 15% of the population, but Muslims, that you would think that France would at this point already be in serious difficulties.
Yeah.
That would be the response to, like, the Charlie Hebdo and the Bataclan and several other terror attacks, big ones, on French soil. And then, and as I've said before, these terror attacks happened in the context of the media reporting repeatedly and loudly about the immigrants coming into Europe, including France, from Middle Eastern countries, Muslims, and amongst them, big headlines saying that amongst the immigrants were ISIS terrorists hiding masquerading as refugees, and these are the people who carried out these atrocious terror attacks on French soil. I mean, that right there is you'd think that any rational thinking person who has any self-preservation instinct would say, I don't want freaking refugees coming into this country, because you've just told me that ISIS, the ones who shoot 80 people in a concert hall, are amongst them. So no. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's not rocket science, It's like, do you want this mass murderer in your neighborhood? No. I mean, that would just, you, in a certain sense, you would think,
don't worry, we have a file on him and we're watching him from afar.
Right. Yeah. Well, you would think that everybody, regardless of their inclinations, left or right, would say, that's a bad idea. I don't want any mass murderers in my town. Right? But
they would naturally come to that conclusion among themselves. Right.
Everybody would. But at the same time, as people were being propagandized, or specifically the right-wingers, the ones who are, more conservative, as at the same time as they were being targeted with that kind of propaganda, the left-wingers were being targeted at exactly the same time, on the same day maybe, as they're being told that ISIS are amongst the refugees. They're putting up pictures for the left-wingers with the bleeding hearts of refugee babies dead on a Greek seashore. Mm.
Which had been going
on.
But
that right there is going to, that's giving you a difficult choice. Based on your inclinations, you're going to say, what's most important to me?
Yeah.
Protecting our identity and our in-group from the foreigners who want to kill us, or saving the poor baby. And that way you split, like Moses parting the Red Sea, you can split a population along those innate moral kind of inclinations.
It takes effort to maintain it, though, or to resplit it, because the sea will come back and it'll be a crashing wave, and you'll get what's going on in France, and the state literally crapping itself.
Well, in France that happens, but like I said, it may have more, that kind of strategy might have more success in other countries, you know. As
Okay.
you, I don't know, you know, it depends on the makeup of the people in the specific country, you know. I mean, one effect obviously of the immigration, the biggest effect of the whole mass immigration to Europe in European countries has been this rise of the right that everybody keeps talking about, you know. In Germany, you know, the Alternative for Deutschland, right wing kind of conservative party, gets a lot of votes in the last election last year or the year before, and then you have a right wing conservative party coming to power in Italy. And you also,
Well, that's an interesting case. That's
Yeah.
kind of like yellow vest in power,
right,
because you've got right
Well,
and left.
but it's more complex, I suppose. But it's a new party, let's say, and
Yeah.
they're anti-Europe and they're they're anti-system type thing, you know. So
Populist, as in they're popular.
they're populist, and fundamentally, they're any party that is anti-European Union is almost by definition nationalistic,
Right.
because
And
they say we don't want to be part of your conglomerate. We're Italians. We want to control our own destiny. Basically, that's a conservative, line. And you also see, obviously, in Poland, there's been a big swing to the right, and in Hungary, and the Austrians seem to be going towards a more kind of conservative.
Well, they were way ahead of the curve.
Bent, yeah,
They had a far right, in quotes, Nazi, in quotes,
right.
party in a coalition back in 2000.
Hmm.
Jörg Haider, well, he met in unfortunate ends. You wonder about that.
Yeah.
Seeing as we mentioned it at the top of the show, I mean, we're into the kind of hardcore left-right of the big political issues, but do we want to say anything about the way in which divisiveness comes through, like everything, like between the sexes? And
Yeah.
what's the conspiracy there? The counter narrative, the exposure of it would say that it's something like a feminist conspiracy, or it at least grows out of the devouring of academia by postmodernism
Hmm.
and hard pseudo-leftist, neo-Marxist, whatever it is, philosophy at the root of it.
Hmm.
I'd love to know how much this has taken root in the population.
Mm.
It's because you can't trust that what you're seeing on the internet is a decent snapshot
I think
of the population's.
Yeah, but I think fundamentally that's another fracture point, and it's between men and women. I mean, that's the simple overview of the situation is that clearly there's an attempt from somewhere. You don't have to say it's a conscious conspiracy of somebody in the dark suits and or the dark black hats in some smoky room somewhere plotting it, but certainly there's forces at work that seem to be have been attempting to divide men and women and set them against each other. So at a social level, you have an attempt to divide the population down the middle and set them at each other's throats, and then you have an attempt to set at a more finite or detailed level of biological sexes. You have someone trying to divide men and women against each other and have them argue and not be friends. The bottom line in all this, obviously, is that you see people in society at the level of men and women, at the level of left and right, at the level of, at religious levels, let's say, I mean, even a broader level would be Christianity versus Islam and stuff. There's clearly something is dividing the population, very sharply. And you can reasonably posit that even if it's not a conscious conspiracy, that can only benefit the people in power, if they're the ones who really need to be called to account. They're not the ones being called to account because people are too busy fighting with each other.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But the whole feminist manosphere, red-pilled male thing is... It's another discussion type thing, but we would have to get into. I don't think we have time for it today, but ultimately, all of the details are just, like I said, manifestations of people kind of swallowing ideologies and swallowing hardcore black and white oversimplified beliefs about reality and the way society works, and then running with it and being encouraged and being kind of been encouraged by, again, come back to the internet, finding encouragement and finding validation for that black and white thinking on the internet with other people, and getting together in groups, and it's kind of echo chambers.
Tribes.
Yeah, tribes, and we all believe this, and it's so hardcore truth. It's amazing. It just blew my mind, and isn't this? And the thing is, a lot of those things are true, and they do have a lot of truth in them about.
You can find a lot by, as I phrased it to you earlier, by trying it on.
Yeah.
Trying on an ideology in quotes or a set of ideas.
Right.
The trick, though, is the trap is where you actually, it precipitates, and that's it. I'm not letting anything else in past this wall I've just put up around it.
I've found the answer, basically, and that's it. That's stupid because, human development is a unending process of discovery and learning, more and more, and learning, more and more complexity, effectively, in any topic that you get into. So when you first get into something, you say, wow, this is amazing information. It just makes so much sense of everything. Well, don't stop there at all. You've just stepped in the door, and it's just one part of the puzzle, and there's
find out what the whole house is like before you buy it.
Right. Yeah. And don't go looking to buy anything anyway. You're just collecting information, putting together a jigsaw puzzle, basically, and it's a very big one.
We'll switch gears here. We'll probably find a way that it all plays back in. I want to bring up Mike Pompeo's visit to Cairo.
The honourable representative of the Koch brothers.
Mike Pompeo, he's Trump's guy, but he's not. He is. I think he was maybe a state representative in Kansas. And Kansas is the home of the Koch brothers, their industries, and now their huge political influence, lobbying in American politics, and not just in D.C. I'm reading a book by Jane Meyer, Dark Money. Now, she has a particular slant on things. She's in it to expose the dark money behind big conservative politicians, think tanks, groups, etc. It's worth reading in its own right to give you an idea of how the money flows. Of course, it's not the end of the story, because we know there's a Soros network and other philanthropists who donate billions to Democrats and people on the other side of all these political arguments. But Mike Pompeo was known at some point. He had the moniker. He was so politically bought by the Koch brothers that he was the representative from Koch, not from Kansas. It's super interesting, because here he is in government nominally working under a president who was the only one of the 15 candidates for the RNC nomination who was not a Koch brothers recipient of campaign donations. They specifically didn't like him. They had earmarked up to $1 billion to give to the winner of the Republican nomination to then face off against Hillary. They withdrew that when Trump won it, and instead invested it in concentrating on local races to get the right stuff in and around Trump. Lo and behold, 2 years into the first administration of Trump, Mike Pompeo is a Koch brothers guy. Mike Pence is a Koch brothers guy. So it's anyway, so Pompeo goes to Cairo. It's 10 years since Obama did the same thing. And his infamous/famous, however you saw it, speech in Cairo, in which this would be a reversal of 10 years of Bush, and we're sorry, basically. He didn't say we're sorry, really, but it was meant to convey contrition for American foreign policy in the Middle East after 9/11. It
was all horseshit, obviously.
It was horseshit because it just continued under another guise. So now, 10 years after that, we have Mike Pompeo going to Cairo to announce he's shaking it all
change.
Up. So let's have a listen.
We're going to stop it a little bit here and there, probably.
Secretary of State Pompeo on a 9-city tour in the Middle East, today delivering what the New York Times called, quote, a scathing and quite personal rejection of President Barack Obama's approach to the Middle East, excoriating Mr. Obama for fundamental misunderstandings about the region that underestimated the tenacity and viciousness of radical Islamism. Take a look at the strikingly different messages in 2009 and then today.
Assalamu alaikum.
It was here in this city, that another American stood before you. He told you that radical Islamist terrorism does not stem from an ideology.
Islam is not part of the problem in combating violent extremism. It is an important part of promoting peace.
Okay, pause it there. That's supposed to be two contrary statements. But Pompeo isn't contradicting Obama as such. Obama never said that there was an ideological problem. He was saying that Islam is not the problem. And so it's kind of semantics, but on the other hand it isn't, because what's implied in what Pompeo is saying is that Islam is a political ideology, period, and not a religion. As such, then, he doesn't mean to, but he is unconsciously making no distinction between radical Islamists and terrorism and everything that goes with it and the image of it with Islam. This is the worst thing you can say when you go to Cairo and speak to scholars and diplomats in the Middle East. You're trying to win them to your side, but actually, if you compare notes, he's trying to offset himself from Obama. But Obama's message is the one that's going to win friends and influence people in the Middle East versus his.
Right.
Okay, let's carry on.
I told you that 9/11 led my country to abandon its ideals, particularly in the Middle East.
The attacks of September 11, 2001, and the continued efforts of these extremists to engage in violence against civilians has led some in my country to view Islam as inevitably hostile not only to America and Western countries, but also to human rights. All this has bred more fear and more mistrust.
He told you that the United States and the Muslim world needed, quote, a new beginning, end of quote.
I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world.
The good news is this. The age of self-inflicted American shame is over, and so are the policies that produce so much needless suffering. Now comes the real new beginning.
You ain't seen nothing yet. The age of self-inflicted shame. Like, I think he's trying to, he's saying Obama arrived here and was contrite before you. And that was his fundamental mistake. So we're not sorry for anything. Sorry, not sorry.
Well, there was a guy after that in the Fox News studio. They had a guy on who followed up and explained for Fox News viewers what was really going on. Some general or something, or a colonel or something or other. And one of the things he mentioned about, I suppose the flaw in Obama's policy was pulling out of Iraq because that gave rise to ISIS. And America was too meek, essentially, saying, going and helping the Iraqis, for example, by invading and bombing their country and killing 1.5 million of them, and then just leaving and giving rise to ISIS. I mean, the problem is, in that guy's analysis of it, it's just, he's not even wrong. There's so much wrong with it that it's just, I don't know where to begin, basically, obviously. But ultimately, this is, it's American exceptionalism. I mean, you're just hearing from both Obama. Obama's just trying to manipulate people with a contrite kind of like, it's a manipulation where he talked about, he's still trying to further, Obama was still trying to further American foreign policy, but just through a nicey approach. It was more freedom and democracy, basically, whereas Pompeo now is saying, no, we're going to be hardcore, we're going to be straight with people, and we're going to attack radical Islam, and we're going to deal with this problem in the Middle East. And it never occurs to these people to, shut the hell up and go home. And who the hell are you anyway? You know what I mean? But it's absolutely part of the fabric of our reality right now that America has an absolute right, unspoken, absolutely 100% intuited, assumed right to invade or involve itself in everybody's business, up to and including invading and bombing and threatening to do that. And that's where I just have to say, okay, stall the digger there, you know. Let's go back to the beginning and question your assumption that the US has any right, or should, not even a right, but in the interest of the American people, should be involving itself in all these conflicts around the world. Because you know what? The world doesn't need America. I mean, it's a typical pathological ploy for someone to insist that I'm doing this.
Without us, you live in hell.
Right, I'm doing this for you. And it's like, but have you listened to the person who said, leave me the F alone? I don't want your help, thank you. No, you're delusional. I need to be here and it's for you. Dude, obviously you're doing it for your own interests, for your own agenda, to serve your own selfish agenda. And you're presenting it as this magnanimous, altruistic, helping all these people around the world, and I have to deal with these problems or nobody else would deal with them. And America has done so much to help the world. No, it hasn't. It objectively has not done so much to help. It's done far more. It's had a far more negative effect on the world, objectively, since it has been particularly influential in the world, say, over the last 100 years. It's had a far more pernicious effect on the world than a beneficial one. And there, I mean, you could spend the next 10 minutes listing all of the examples of how that is absolutely true.
Mike Pompeo wouldn't agree with you. He went on to say, America has always been and will always be a liberating force, not an occupying power.
But that's nonsense.
We've never dreamed of domination in the Middle East.
Well, that's nonsense.
Can you say the same about Iran?
But that's complete nonsense. Why would, I mean, the guy afterwards that I'm talking about, the colonel talked about, we need to push back against ISIS and we need to deal with ISIS because, it's our responsibility to deal with radical Islamic terrorism, even though you're the ones who are actually ISIS's air force for the past 7 years in Syria. So you're full of shit. Absolutely. And also to push back against Iran, because Iran wants to, wants to push Saudi Arabia, wants to take the place of Saudi Arabia. And I'm like, you have a problem with the Iranians who are not head choppers taking the place of the body boy head choppers in Saudi Arabia that you're best buddies with? Is that not a point that should be brought up? Why is America concerned that Iran will displace Saudi Arabia, that chops all sorts of body parts off for no good reason whatsoever, and is the most restrictive and oppressive dictatorship in the Middle East, that is also the source of radical Islam that you supposedly want to fight, and they're your best friends? Oh, but it's complicated. No, okay, it's complicated. Explain it. Yeah. Stop bullshitting everybody and explain exactly what your agenda is, and you'll find that it's exactly the opposite of what you say. It's not about freedom and democracy. It's not about helping the world. It's not about dealing with radical Islam. It's exactly the opposite of all of those things. It's about fueling radical Islam through your alliance with Saudi Arabia. It's about dominating and occupying and controlling as many strategically important, i.e. resource-rich countries in the world. That's what your agenda is. Just own it. 12-step program, the first step, Get up and admit that you're a frickin'... You're
an addict.
You're addicted to domination and control.
He also said, we assembled a coalition to liberate Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. Would the Russians or Chinese come to your rescue in the same way, the way that we have? It's just like,
what, a piddly little pinprick of a country called Kuwait in the Middle East? Is that?
But if that's his narrative, well, then the counter to that is Syria.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing you've been screaming about the last few years,
right.
that Russia came and propped up the Syrian regime.
Yeah. No, I mean, if Saddam wanted to invade Kuwait and he had his own reasons for invading Kuwait, that were as legitimate as those as reasons go in the geopolitical sphere. What interest is it of yours, America?
Between the lines,
what's your interest?
Between the lines, that's as honest as he's going to get, because he's saying, "I'm here. I can sell American military might. We can sell you actual equipment.
American protection racket.
A protection racket." And we're in competition with those Russians and the Chinese for this region.
That's the
that's
real
as
truth
honest as it's going to get in terms of a geopolitical explanation.
Right. But now that people have that, then they can follow it through. It's very easy once you understand that broad scale, motivation of pushing back against Russia and China, because America is existentially afraid of losing its position as top dog in the world, and then follow that through as to what America would do
to maintain
that. And it's got bugger all to do with freedom and democracy.
Or saving people from
ISIS. Or saving people from ISIS, or stopping radical Islam. In fact, radical Islam, as we've seen in Syria for the past 7 years, has served you very well. John Kerry, very explicitly, it's on our YouTube channel, Stop Media. John Kerry, recording of John Kerry stating that the American government, and this was back in 2014 or whatever, under Obama, Obama, the great liberator, and the bleeding heart. I want everybody to, live wonderful, peaceful lives together in wonderful diversity and stuff. Under Obama, the U.S. government deliberately allowed ISIS. Well, at a time when they said they were bombing it and they were in Syria to bomb and attack ISIS, John Kerry said they allowed ISIS to carry on and do its thing, which evidence suggests they also included them funding and arming and sending weapons to them through various different channels. They allowed them to do that so that they could overthrow the Syrian government. And he's on record as saying it.
The other thing that's interesting about the timing of this, John Bolton preceded him to the Middle East. I think they're traveling together. As the report said, they're going to visit
3 of them. There's
countries.
Pompeo, Bolton, and John Bolton's moustache. It has it has its own seat on the airplane.
It has its own demands.
Yeah,
I want to see.
Yeah.
Raytheon.
Right.
And this is like you get a sense of how alone Trump is.
Yeah.
When Pompeo basically undercuts what Trump's been saying for the last month about drawing down
And Bolton.
pulling out of sand and death. There's nothing in it for us.
No, that people crap their pants. The protected ones, the ones who have signed up to the protection racket, America's protection racket in the Middle East, they crap their pants when they heard Trump say that, because it's all changing. It's like that change is scary, I mean, yeah, Russia is kind of asserting itself in the Middle East, but it hasn't been there long enough, and those countries like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Jordan, Egypt, to a large extent, are all American kind of client, American protectorates in the Middle East, and they don't want to see their patron just up and leave. Like it scares them, because they don't know what's going to happen. It's not just that Russia might not be able to provide the same protection, although and it probably wouldn't want to, but they like it this way. They don't want to have to be honest brokers with their neighbors type thing. They want a big brother, as America has been doing, to come in, to stay there, and continue to do what it's been doing, which is threaten everybody to stay in line and to operate along the guidelines that America sets. Mm-hmm. It's much easier, because then you can really just be a puppet, and just deal with your local issues type thing. But the broader Middle East is locked down and is stable. If America goes, they think that's instability will break out, and who knows what could happen. They may be, who knows what the future would hold for them in that respect. So that's why you had Pompeo and Bolton come in and go, okay, hang on a minute. Trump doesn't really mean that. We're not going anywhere. And he goes on a 9-day whistle-stop tour, patting everybody in the head, saying, calm down. He's handing out freaking Xanax or Valium or something to everybody. Chill out, everybody. It's okay. We're not going anywhere.
Yeah.
Bush or Trump is, he just don't know what he's talking about.
The irony is, if if it had not been for either Obama administration or a continuation in the so-called right-wing equivalent of a U.S. government, the Middle East as a whole would be on its way to democratizing by now. The case in point, Yemen. Yemen had basically a coup, but it popped after years of the Arab Spring protests, which were also mega in Yemen too.
Mm-hmm.
It finally came to a head in a coup with popular backing.
Mm-hmm.
Then it became immediately, quite quickly, a civil war in 2015 when Saudi Arabia, nominally, in quotes, Saudi Arabia, really it's a Western war against Yemen to maintain the existing order in that country. Because if, to quote an older US Democrat, so a leftist from the 1960s, if one of those little commie countries falls, or falls to, one of those little Asian countries falls to communism, they all fall like dominoes.
Right.
The domino theory. It's a real fear for them because Yemen goes, well, then there's pressure on Saudi Arabia to reform and an actual upwelling of democracy. Roughly, by that I simply mean that leadership that is broadly in line with the popular will.
Right.
Simply that. Not any kind of,
Yeah.
ideological variants of imported Western democracy, like literally. Although it might take, who knows what forms it would take. I mean, Syria, not case in point. I mean, Syria it arguably is one of the last few bastions of a reasonably secular, nationalistic, therefore in line with the will of the people, therefore democratic countries in the Middle East. Thanks to al-Assad's father and then, of course, the current president. And that's why they hated him so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I think the one, if I were to tie this back to our earlier discussion, the one thing people should see in this is that there's no real difference between Obama's vision of America and the Middle East and Pompeo's version. Well, what is the difference between those two? This is supposed to be a whole new government for America that's so radically different that America's tearing itself apart.
Mm-hmm.
Over this current government, but it's basically the same. The difference, of course, comes down to one person, really, Trump,
mm-hmm.
who the Americans voted for. But it shows you, it shows you that it was always going to take a lot more than electoral success of a maverick, a surprise, and a godsend, let's say, from the perspective of the majority of Americans. Oh, thank God, Trump's there. Whew. Well, we dodged a bullet here. It'll take time, but we'll basically revert back to some normal things.
No, you've got a deep state. You've got the unelected power behind the throne that's been there for a very long time. And now you're up against that, I mean, it's a real battle. But the benefit of that has been a lot of things have been revealed as a result of that conflict between the deep state and between Trump. And that's as good. The best thing you can say about the Trump presidency, effectively, is that, in a broader sense, that it has revealed an awful lot to a lot of people, certainly those who were with eyes to see, and it's so in that sense it's been a good thing, But I think we're going to have to leave it there for this week because we're getting close to the top of the hour. So, so I hope you enjoyed the show. We will be back. If you liked it, click like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. If even if you didn't like it, like and subscribe anyway, just because. We'll be back next week with another show. So until then, thanks for watching, listening, and have a good evening.
Bye. See you next week.